How do you craft a horror movie to stand out from the rest of the pack? The genre is typically one of the most saturated in the entire cinematic landscape, with far too many of them falling below par and earning a reputation that doesn't reflect some of the all-time classic movies it boasts. Something that trips movies up all too often is the ultimate reveal of a mysterious villain. If you're going to spend 2 hours building up to a big reveal, you had better make damn sure it's worth it in the end. Just before we start, here's your spoiler warning. Proceed with caution, there are spoilers ahead. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture, here with 10 horror movie villain reveals that everyone hated. Number 10. William Schenk didn't die in Spiral. Everyone's been on the receiving end of that old adage, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. It really stings, and it's the exact feeling that so many fans and audiences had towards Spiral at the point of the underwhelming and unsurprising villainous reveal. With 7 sequels since the original movie released in 2004, it's fair to say that the franchise had outstayed its welcome, until Chris Rock offered to breathe new life into Saw with Spiral. This was to be a different take and a fresh angle on a tired franchise, and it had great potential. A weak 37% tomato meter score is buoyed by a relatively impressive 75% audience score, but you can bet both would have been a lot higher without the disappointing reveal that William was the killer. It simply elicited groans from audiences and lamentations that they got their hopes up for something better. The reveal was telegraphed early and often, thanks in no small part to unconvincing misdirects and impossible to miss signs. Will's supposed death, intended to throw audiences off the scent, was literally the only one that happened off screen, and the movie just expected audiences to buy it without even thinking twice. This was really an insult, and ultimately led to an underwhelming moment that undermined the entire movie. Spiral wasn't a bad entry in the franchise, but it could have been so much better. Number 9. Gregory Butler's obvious motivation in Happy Death Day to You. The key to keeping a mystery alive throughout a movie's run is to keep the audience guessing. Those watching have to be presented with more than one potential outcome to keep their minds flooded with uncertainty. What can't happen is to just have one single predictable outcome from the very beginning. This is exactly what happened with Happy Death Day to You. The first movie was a surprisingly fun take on a Groundhog Day-esque time loop, but the sequel couldn't live up to what came before it. In particular, the villain let the movie down in a big way. This was where there was only one genuinely plausible option presented to audiences, and everyone picked up on it. The killer was Dr. Gregory Butler, the same professor that Tree had an affair with in the original, ultimately painting the target upon her back. In the sequel, there was no one other than Butler who had any motive for trying to kill Tree, and no one else with any real connection, emotional or otherwise, to the previous story. This was always going to be resented by audiences, not only because it was so obvious, but because the original movie's reveal was just so much better. Number 8. Brahms is a doll after all in Brahms the Boy 2. There is something of a theme that runs through this list in that plenty of horror sequels try to tie things together from across their respective franchises with certain villainous reveals. Whether that's via a previous character reappearing, a familial connection, or something else. Brahms the Boy 2 tries to do something similar, but misses the mark entirely. Throughout the first movie, the audience is led to believe that the villain is a creepy possessed doll, until the revelation that Brahms himself, the presumed dead boy the doll is named after, is still alive and living in the walls of the house. The doll was just a doll. This was a clever, genuinely surprising twist, but the sequel took it and retconned it completely. It's confirmed during The Boy 2 that the porcelain doll is in fact sentient and has been manipulating children for generations. This includes the human Brahms, rendering the twist at the conclusion of the first movie completely irrelevant. Such a U-turn within the franchise makes absolutely no sense. The first movie set in place certain rules and lore only for the sequel to unapologetically fly in the face of them, and while this was undeniably a surprising revelation, it wasn't a good one. Number 7. John Shooter was a split personality in Secret Window. Secret Window is one of the lesser recognised credits of Johnny Depp's long CV, and is unfortunately a rather forgettable one. An interesting premise to be sure, but the movie was let down by, among other things, its big plot twist. Mort Rainey is a writer plagued by plenty of issues, not least of which is a seemingly deranged stalker, claiming to have been plagiarised by Depp's character. It's an interesting enough story, but the ultimate reveal, one that was overused at the time anyway, anyway is made just too obvious throughout to ever be a true shock. Mort was very clearly a troubled man, and his creative mind had essentially run away from him. It soon became relatively easy to put together that John Shooter, the man terrorizing his life, was a figment of his own imagination. Shooter never interacted with anyone else in the movie, only Mort, and with the writer using exactly the same accent as Shooter when he donned the hat his stalker wore in the market, it wasn't the most well-hidden twist. Movies have utilized angles similar to this time and time again over the years, and with Secret Window coming in the wake of the likes of Fight Club and Identity, even if it wasn't so predictable, it still wouldn't have been that interesting. Number 6. The Darkseeker's last-minute switcheroo in I Am Legend. Okay, a bit of a different one this time. I Am Legend has its share of flaws, some of them rather large, and it was certainly guilty of a few things that ultimately made it difficult to fully enjoy. However, one of the movie's greatest sins was simply not understanding the source material it adapted. This is never more obvious than when looking at the villains of the movie, the Darkseekers. Robert Neville's fight in Richard Matheson's novel is ultimately about perspective, humanity, and morality, whereas in the movie there was simply as much CGI thrown at the screen as possible for what was supposed to be an exciting final battle. The original plan for the villainous zombie/vampires was to have actors in prosthetics bring them to life, but this was ultimately ditched in favour of CGI. Unfortunately, making this switch so late into production meant that many of the effects were inconsistent at best and incomplete at worst. There is a decent amount of tension and mystery while the Darkseekers are little more than shadows, but after finally seeing them in all their computer-generated glory, the audience can appreciate that they were far better left to the imagination. Number 5. The Boogeyman's terrible CGI reveal in Boogeyman. If you think back to the most iconic movies in the history of the horror genre, some of the best utilize practical effects where possible over CGI. In some ways, it has become something of a point of pride. However, computer effects are still incredibly important, and when done well, can make a movie look genuinely beautiful. Unfortunately, this isn't the case with a lot of movies, particularly in the horror genre. There are a few examples of woeful CGI on this list, but that of Boogeyman is arguably the worst. The 2005 outing was critically panned for a laundry list of reasons, but one of its more unforgivable sins is the titular monster itself. If you're going to invent a story about a monster that hides in a closet and subsequently root for a protagonist with a fear of said closet, it needs to pay off in a big way. As could be expected in a monster movie such as this, the Boogeyman was kept obscured for the majority of the flick, building the tension so that when the creature finally did appear, it was terrifying. That's not exactly how this reveal went down though. In fact, it couldn't have been further from terrifying. It was hilariously bad. Number 4. Roman Bridger's family ties in Scream 3. There are many different boxes that need to be checked for a villain to be memorable, particularly in the horror genre. With so many movies and so many villains in the saturated corner of the Hollywood landscape, there is a necessity to stand out, and in such a department, the Scream movies have typically been a mixed bag. At the top of the list are the likes of Billy and Stu from the first movie, the latter of which was a genuinely surprising reveal, while at the bottom are Scream 2's Debbie and Mickey. Clearly, it takes more than just the iconic image of Ghostface to make a strong villain. Arguably the worst villain reveal of the entire franchise came in Scream 3, the consensus low point of the franchise. The idea was there, with Roman Bridger tying together some of the lore established in the previous 2 movies, but even so, it still managed to be boring. Roman's insertion into the role just felt too forced, as the character was too plain to be believable as a killer. Eliciting anger from an audience is one thing, but at least there is emotion in it. For such a reveal to be so uninspired, to provoke absolutely nothing from an audience, is even worse. This was what happened when Roman revealed himself as Sidney's brother and the forgettable villain of the forgettable threequel. Number 3. Michael Myers lives in Halloween Resurrection. Okay, so this one is slightly different to the rest. While most of these hated moments revealed the identity of the villain, Halloween Resurrection pissed audiences off with the reveal of how Michael Myers was still alive. At the end of Halloween H2O, it seemed as though Laurie Strode had finally defeated her masked nemesis once and for all, until he was resurrected for the 8th movie in the series 4 years later. If you're going to bring a thought-to-be-dead character back, that's one thing, but at least do it in a way that makes sense. Halloween Resurrection is to many the consensus pick for the worst movie in the franchise, and it's hard to argue with. No one needed it, but arguably its greatest sin was retconning the death of one of the most iconic and infamous villains in horror movie history. Actively undoing the finale of H2O 4 years earlier, Resurrection showed that Michael was never decapitated by Laurie, as instead it turns out that he managed to swap places with an ambulance driver, luring his would-be killer to instead take the life of an innocent man. This was senseless and genuinely insulting to the fans. Number 2. Roy is behind the mask in Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. By the time any franchise gets to its 5th movie, there is a very real danger of it becoming stale and outstaying its welcome. Even the beloved Toy Story has been met with skepticism with the announcement of yet another sequel, and things were no different for Friday the 13th. An iconic and influential franchise without a doubt, but by the time the 5th movie, A New Beginning, came around, something needed to change. This something was bringing in a new killer and leaving Jason Voorhees on the bench. In theory, the idea was there, but the execution wasn't. The issue was that the new killer chosen, obscured by Jason's famous hockey mask for the majority of the movie until the big reveal, was nobody special. Instead, Roy was merely a paramedic seen in the opening stages, and though there was an attempt to flesh him out with a backstory when the mask was removed, it was too little and too late. Roy was no more than a forgettable character from the early stages of the movie that audiences had no connection to and no reason to care about. With shoes as big as Jason's to fill as a villain, Roy was given no chance, and unsurprisingly, Pamela's son was subsequently returned to the franchise. Number 1. Will Benson is Ben's son in I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. Once again, we come back to a horror franchise trying to make a shocking revelation out of a familial relationship. It's a trope that is completely overused in the genre to the point that it has lost all effectiveness unless done spectacularly well. Unfortunately, this just isn't the case for I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. As a movie on the whole, this sequel has been ripped to shreds by both critics and audiences, with Rotten Tomatoes scores of 7% and 29% respectively, and isn't helped by its clunky villain reveal. As if it weren't bad enough that Ben, the killer from the first movie, was revealed to still be alive, how about that his son Will just so happens to be one of the friends Julie takes to the Bahamas? Then there is the fact that this truth has been staring audiences in the face all movie thanks to the characters' names. Will Benson was revealed to be Ben's son, Ben Willis's son. It feels vaguely similar to Shutter Island's Law of Four, with the huge clues being in the names all along, but in a much dumber way. And that concludes our list. If you think we missed any, then do let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also, head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.